This is the first time I've ever been introduced by the voice of God. It's quite an interesting experience. But thank you for inviting me to your forum. Today's discussion is extremely important to the future course of our country. Global industrial competitiveness continues to be one of our greatest and most complex national challenges. Thank you, Sam Allen, for leading the Council on Competitiveness from your perch atop Deere & Company, one of our most iconic and innovative American companies. We all know that busy people seem to take it upon themselves to be even busier, and you're a good role model for other CEOs. Thank you also, Deborah Wince-Smith, for leading the Council and for your prior service to the country when you were in charge of the technology administration at the Department of Commerce. Back then, our country was concerned about critical and strategic technologies and industries, but that message later dissipated, and for too long we failed to invest in our technology infrastructure and pursue the interests of American industries in global markets. Today, we continue to deal with global competition and the new reality. That, in fact, was the title of the January 1985 report issued by Hewlett-Packard CEO John Young that was the genesis of the Council on Competitiveness. Here it is. This is the 1985 report. It's a collector's item. And when you read it, it's déjà vu all over again, as Yogi Berra so famously said. We almost don't have to produce a new report describing our global competitiveness challenges. We could use some whiteout on the date, 1985, type in a new date, 2018, using an obsolete IBM Selectrate typewriter. Remember those? They're a relic of the past. Someday they'll be auction items. Then we'd be back in business. The 1985 report concludes, and I quote, "Americans must take on the challenge of competitiveness as the economic agenda for the next decade. It's not our goal to compete by decreasing the real incomes of our people." It notes that the U.S. needs to tackle the challenges of unfair trade, an uncompetitive tax structure, an overvalued dollar, workforce training and education, and burdensome regulations. Since 1985, so little has changed, and yet so much has changed. Today, we confront a competitive challenge at least as big and probably bigger than the one we faced in the mid-1980s. Then it was Japan. Now it's personified by China. We in the Trump administration have embraced that challenge, and we are working to address our shortfalls. We're looking carefully at the recommendations your council has provided in its recent analysis entitled Turbocharging the Manufacturing Renaissance in an Era of Energy Abundance. Thank you for taking the time and devoting the resources in engaging with us in adopting, as your report states, bold and collaborative policy solutions that leverage America's total innovation ecosystem, industry, academia, labor, and the national laboratories. We already have taken several initial specific actions to implement some of your recommendations, and we're trying to develop strategies for making others happen. Our corporate tax code has been modernized and is now competitive with our global trading partners. In fact, last year at Davos, 2 foreign country finance ministers accosted me saying that this was a protectionist activity on our part to lower our tax rate. So it tells me that they're getting the message. It did make us a lot more competitive. We're also easing the burden of regulations on domestic producers who've been at an unnecessary competitive disadvantage for decades. Regulatory reforms, along with new technologies, have been particularly helpful to the extraction of hydrocarbons and has contributed very much to America's energy abundance. We're also fully engaged in reforming our workforce development programs. You'll be hearing more about this next week. Ivanka and I are going to be at the White House rolling out some more activities in that regard. So human skills, human resources are a very, very major focus of the administration. We're trying hard to inculcate the skills that will lead to higher workforce participation ratios. We're trying to improve the productivity of federal R&D and bring it at least up to the level of productivity of university research. As far as we can tell, universities are about twice as productive in terms of real-world output as federal research. And we've got a whole task force working on trying to correct that problem. I'll talk in a minute about our new initiative aimed at improving the return on investment on federal R&D. But first, there are actually two areas that I think we're emphasizing even more than what was discussed in the Council's report on turbocharging the manufacturing renaissance. The first is space. We have reconstituted the National Space Council and are promoting actively the development of the commercial space industry. Space is already a $350 billion a year industry in this country and could well become a $1 trillion a year one in the United States, creating thousands and thousands of new jobs for Americans, and just as importantly, resulting in major scientific advances. Because materials act so differently in a low-gravity or no-gravity environment, there's active R&D in space involving such areas as 3D printing, creation of new pharmaceuticals, and other things yet under development. So I'm very optimistic about the impact that our space activities will have. These programs, along with the excitement generated by the commercial space launch industry, may stimulate young people to pursue once again studies in STEM subjects. As you're well aware, one of the big difficulties is that our educational system has not been providing a combination of either vocational training for those who are not college-bound, nor proper STEM studies for those who are. But everyone gawked as that red Tesla convertible was launched into outer space, and again just this week as the InSight lander landed on Mars. With the new generation of illustrious role models in the private sector, this fresh interest in the sciences among students could happen in a manner similar to when JFK sparked interest with the moonshot. We need it because our schools are not properly preparing young people with the skills required in an increasingly technological world. Equally important is the protection of intellectual property rights. They form the basis for our future economic growth. The President and I recently signed our 10 millionth patent, an achievement unparalleled anywhere else in the world. The most interesting part to me is that half of those patents were issued within the last 30 years. So the entire innovation history as reflected in patents prior to 30 years ago was matched in number of patents in that 30-year period. So if anything, the pace of innovation is accelerating. Our patent and trademark system works well with one major exception, China. We must resolve China's forced transfers of technology, their institutionalization of cyber theft, their deliberate infiltration of our companies, our universities, and our national laboratories, their state-sponsored venture capital investments at uneconomical prices to gain access to breakthrough technologies, their subsidies, and literally hundreds of trade and market access barriers that they erect against our most innovative companies. But there are American limits to the role of government. Unlike China, our government cannot simply dictate industrial policy. In some ways, it would make it easier to compete with China if we could, but that would be antithetical to our concept of a free market economy. No other country has created the colossal industries that are driving global growth, such as the internet, smartphones, and medical science. Many of these innovations got their start with the help of federal R&D funding. But it was the private sector that spun these technologies out of the laboratories and into the economy. With this in mind, we are undertaking a major new initiative aimed at maximizing the impact of our $150 billion annual federal investment in research and development. We also need the U.S. private sector and not our overseas rivals to benefit from taxpayer-funded R&D. So last April, we launched the Return on Investment Initiative for Unleashing American Innovation. This program improves upon the two landmark legislations that guide most activities involving federal technology transfer, the Stevenson-Weidler Technology Innovation Act and the Bayh-Dole Patent and Trademark Amendments Act. Both acts passed in 1980, almost 40 years ago, and they need to be updated. These laws do not fully protect the intellectual property of private sector partners that signed the so-called CRADAs, Cooperative Research and Development Agreements, with federal agencies. They limit the ability of researchers funded by the federal government to become entrepreneurs, curbing the potential for the commercialization of inventions. They prohibit the rapid technology transfer from our national labs and universities due to red tape and regulatory burdens. The new initiative is a whole-of-government effort. It involves all agencies involved with federal R&D, from NIST to the NIH, DOE, DOD, USDA, NSF, and NASA. If we had more acronyms, we would undoubtedly use them. We will modernize the U.S. technology transfer system for the 21st century to make it easier for companies, large and small, to engage with federal research enterprise. Earlier this year, we issued a request for information, and we have received advice from hundreds of individuals and organizations. In December, couple weeks from now, we'll have specific timetables for regulatory changes and new legislation. We invite your assistance in bringing these efforts to fruition. It is essential for the United States to maintain technological leadership in the face of increasing levels of investment in science and technology by governments and industries around the world. Economic security defines national security, and technology will define future economic security. We must all work at this together, the public and private sectors, academia, and workers. In effect, all of the members of the Council on Competitiveness. Please continue your work toward the advancement of our great nation. The country depends on your continued civic engagement now more than ever. Thank you for your long-term devotion to improving the prospects of everyone in this room and elsewhere in this country. I look forward to working with the Council in the future. Thank you.